Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. I don't have to tell the JBS audience that what's going on in Israel today represents an unprecedented moment in the state's history. You are about to hear a conversation which has not taken place in the United States in mainstream media until this moment. I am joined by three high-ranking IDF veterans who have, together with hundreds of their fellow soldiers, taken an unprecedented public stand against the current government's plan to overhaul Israel's judiciary. You will hear them today explain why they are so alarmed and disturbed by the proposed changes to Israel's Supreme Court. You will hear them say that it is the reason they have decided to come to America for a couple days to convey to American Jews what is happening and why so much is at stake. I will introduce them now. Their resumes are long but worth hearing, so stay with me. Colonel Reserve Ophir Ber is a seventh-generation Jerusalemite who told me that he grew up alongside ultranationalists, including the now National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. Ophir joined the Flight Academy in 1989. He served for 27 years as an F-16 pilot, and he ended his service as the commander of the Israel Air Force Tech Unit. He and his wife, Shaham, an Air Force organizational psychologist, are raising 6 children together. After Ophir retired from the Air Force, he became the founder and CEO of a cybersecurity startup, which was later acquired, and he's today an advisor to startups and a teacher of cybersecurity at the Reichman University. Ophir does reserve duty as a senior cybersecurity advisor to the Ministry of Defense. Next, we have Colonel Reserve Joab Rosenberg. He grew up in a settlement in the West Bank, one of 7 families there. It has now grown to hundreds. His father, who is Orthodox, was one of the settlement's founders and was the first lawyer to open an office in the city of Ariel in the West Bank back in the 1980s. Joab got his bachelor's in science in physics, and he joined the IDF as a physicist. Since the early 90s, he served in many different posts, mostly in intelligence, and as a commander of an elite tech program called Talpiot. He retired as a colonel in 2014 and started his own software company, which has now closed. He's currently studying graduate physics at the Weizmann Institute. And finally, Brigadier General Reserve Roy Rifton was also born and raised in Israel. His grandparents came there from Eastern Europe a few years before the Holocaust, and he says they practically built the country. Roy joined the Army in 1986 and served for 30 years in the Artillery Corps in all command positions, up to the Chief of Artillery from 2012 to 2015. Roy took part in all of Israel's conflicts since 1986, and all of them in command positions on the front lines or as Chief of Staff. He is married to Nili, an accountant, and is father to 3 children, 2 of whom serve in the Army. Roy has a bachelor degree of law, is a graduate of the MBA program in Bar Ilan University, and after retiring, he moved to the business sector as well, and today is CEO of an AI software company. Welcome to you all.
Thanks.
No slouches in terms of your resumes. I'm really glad to have you all here. I'm going to start with you, Joab. Why are you all sitting here today? Why have you gotten on a plane to come to the U.S.? What is happening that rises, in a sense, to the urgency that you say it does?
Well, it all started about just 10 days ago. We were all, I think, part of the demonstrations going on in Israel for several weeks now. We have many friends that were writing these internal letters of reservists from all different units. And we felt a bit frustrated from the response that we got from the government. You know, we had all kind of difficult statements calling us anarchists, terrorists, traitors sometimes.
I want to make sure I heard. They called you anarchists?
Yeah.
Who's calling you that? The government?
Some of the ministers. Terrorists, I think, was a notion used by the son of the prime minister. There was a minister telling the pilots to go to hell. So that was frustrating, and we started to think, what could we do more to, get a fair response and get people to speak together. And then came up the idea that we need to speak to the US, to the Jewish communities, to the government, to the administration, and to the media, and explain the urgency of what's happening, why we think it's going to be an irreversible move very, very soon, and try to get the attention because we know and we think that the US is our best ally. It's very important for Israel's national security. And as retired and reserve officers, we all thought that our security depends to a large extent on America, and we thought there's a lot to speak about.
And Roy, before we get to what the proposed changes are, for the American audience who doesn't understand how unusual it is for former IDF officers to speak in this way, can you give a sense of what it's been like for you to actually finally make this decision? It's time to go public.
It's really different times in Israel, and you cannot sit at home and just see what's going on and don't take action. We were not educated to do that. We were not brought up to do that. And the protests or the demonstrations are going on for about 9 or 10 weeks already, and there's not really a change. So it brought us to take a stand and try to maybe another way to push things. And just to understand what's going on in Israel, we are in a sense of emergency. We understand that things are going on. There's a lot of changes, and we cannot influence them.
And you all wrote a letter, or co-signed a letter that said this is a moment of emergency, to use your words just now, if the legislation that's proposed that aims to turn the judicial system into a political and non-independent branch of government continues, i.e. the erasure of Israeli democracy, and if a broad consensus is not reached on the issue, we will not continue to volunteer for reserve service in the Special Operations Division. I want to continue a little more. We have served with endless sacrifice this country, which we love so much, but we will not volunteer for reserves when a huge black flag flies over the actions of the government. Can you, Ophir, just explain what does it mean to be in the reserves, and why is it so integral to Israel's national security?
Great question. I was talking at the demonstration yesterday in Washington Square, and I think it relates to what you asked Roy just now. I said I've served under many governments and 7 prime ministers. It's always have been, a matter of strategy, tactics. We understood, the fact that there are different voices and different opinions. But today, the sense of emergency is that we are truly afraid of from losing the trust between the IDF soldiers and the governments or the ministers. In fact, recent voices from Treasury Minister on calling to wipe out a Palestinian village, voices heard from the Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, on how he wants to treat peaceful demonstrators in Tel Aviv, only relates to the fact that when you have no checks and balances, you are starting to ask yourself, is this policy or is this target being really checked? Is this a legal thing to do? And it's a question almost never asked, since we understand we have a robust system of checks and balances. We have a very good process, operational process on how to select the targets. I think it's the best in the world. We've always been trustful and in the fact that we are fighting for right. And now there's a very big question mark on that fact.
And when you mention Huwara and what was said about it, which he has now walked back, but I want you to tell the audience a little bit about those remarks and why they were so striking. You have spent years, decades, following what you believe to be legal orders. And you're saying now that what ensured the legality of those orders was essentially a system that you trusted. And now that system is undermined. Am I right? Am I summarizing that correctly?
I think it's more than that. I think in the decades that we all served, we helped to build that system. We know it from within. We know the efforts that are being implemented in order to make sure that no families or civilians are getting hurt. And it's a very, very difficult task in the arena that we're fighting. We're not fighting in uncivilized areas. We're attacking sometimes in cities where terrorists. Yes, because terrorists are selectively choosing to be there. But we know that they're hiding in hospitals and we hold back. We know that they're firing from mosques, and we check very carefully what does it mean to attack that target that we know it's a terrorist target. So in fact, from within, we know the system and the fact that we have built it to be very robust, and we trust it greatly. But today, it's like we're crossing the watershed line. We're down the cliff, and we don't know where it takes us when legal counsel is treated as holding back the military. You have just said that he drove in the highway and saw a big sign funded by millions of shekels saying, let the IDF win without holding back by the judiciary system. And so when you treat the legal counsel as someone who's holding you back unnecessary.
Explain that to me. Where is the sign? Who's it referring to?
You can tell.
Well, it's one of these big signs on the Israeli Tel Aviv highway.
And
it was funded by the right-wing people supporting the reform. And it was saying we need to change the judiciary to allow the IDF to win the war, which we think is a blunt lie. We've been there, all of us. We've never been held back by a council or by the legal system, the military legal system. The opposite is the truth. They helped us. They gave the right advice. They could help us interpret what's happening and what is legal and what's not. We're the professionals. The intelligence is choosing the right targets. The Air Force and the artillery are shooting when it needs to be shot. And now that you hear people more and more saying, we need to change the balances, not speaking about wiping out villages, that makes us very worried. We all think we served, and our friends are still serving, in a highly moral army, more than other armies, and we want to keep it that way. We all have the confidence in the chief of staff and the generals that are doing the right way. It's not only about legal advisors, it's about the commanders, and we want to be sure that it's staying that way.
Just so we make sure people understand what is being proposed that would alter the landscape that you are describing, which was you felt ethical and moral and you could trust. What are, at least, I know it's complicated, but without getting in the weeds, what are sort of the tent poles of the proposed change?
I think it would be helpful to give two examples.
Okay.
So first of all, the main thing that is going on is trying to weaken the judiciary. And in Israel, we have only two branches because the legislative branch is always, by definition, controlled by the executive branch because we have one election, we have one house, and the prime minister is always the one who won the Knesset. And the other one is the judiciary. So that's the only checks and balances. We don't have a constitution. And it's true from the top when we speak about the supreme judge. And it's also true in the day-to-day work when you work with the legal advisors, which have the job of telling you what's legal and what's not. And we already, before even the legislation went through, we see the government at this very moment actually ignoring the Attorney General. She writes things explicitly and they just ignore it before even changing the law. So that's one example. The other example
of that, I think, is that they wanted to fire the police chief, and she said that was illegal.
That's right.
And they.
But sadly, every day you have another example. So it's happening each and every day now. It's quite crazy.
When people say, "Why don't we wait, see how it plays out?" How do you respond to that? When they say you're being rash in your protest, why don't you see what happens?
There's another difference between the U.S. system and the Israeli is the fact that we do not have a constitution. So if all these changes will take place, there are no way to stop it. And that's why we say it's a kind of emergency, because the legislation is going very fast. Actually, for the past month, they passed out laws that nobody thought that they will do that. And they're going on even as we speak. So that's part of the problem. We say, okay,
it's moving.
It's moving. And We just have to do something in order to stop it.
So I just want to summarize, and I'll go to you. What I understand, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, are basically the three tent poles so that people can just absorb what the overhaul would look like. The government would override Supreme Court decisions. The government would have control over the committee that appoints all of the judges, including Supreme Court judges, and it would practically eliminate the Supreme Court's ability to strike down legislation that violates basic rights of citizens. Does that track for you? Please go ahead, Ophir.
Yes, I think one more change, which is treated as maybe as a minor one, and not with the three that you just mentioned, but it relates to the fact that what we've just discussed on the reservists and the IDF as a whole, and this is the immunity for soldiers. I think that government recognizes the question marks on is it legal what we're doing, and are we holding back or not, and to solve that, they want to legislate the Immune Act for the immunity for soldiers. Some kind of, don't worry, no one will prosecute you on the atrocities that you're going to perform. I think everybody is kind of worried if they're going to be prosecuted, but I think the first thing, the core question for us is, are we doing the moral thing? Then we'll treat it, is it legal or not? And we want to be sure that we are moral. I think that's the Jewish thing to do, that's the human thing to do. And you can't solve it with legislation. You can solve it with a moral code, with checks and balances, with following laws of engagement and war, which is, from our perspective and from the reservists' perspective probably, we're looking at a very wrong direction that the legislation will lead us.
So on March 5th, this is 2023, 37 out of 40 reservists of a Air Force fighter jet squadron called the Hammers, nearly all, said that they would boycott their training session to protest the government's plan. Also on the 6th of March, all of the living former chiefs of the Israeli Air Force co-signed a letter to Bibi Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant expressing their concerns. I just want to quote from that. From a deep familiarity with the central and special weight of the Air Force in national security, which you are well aware of, we are fearful over the consequences of these processes and the serious and tangible danger posed to the national security of the State of Israel. I just want to get to the idea that what you all are doing is essentially in some way saying Israel is now going to be exposed, vulnerable in some way. And just for the American audience to understand kind of the intersection between these judicial changes and what is happening to the military potentially and those who are opposing these changes. I don't think that intersection is necessarily so self-evident.
I think, first of all, I want to focus on the big picture. The big picture is that actually, for the past 2 months since this government came into office, the process is changing Israel from a democracy probably to a dictatorship. It will take time, but they will get there.
And you're using that word very consciously, dictatorship.
That's exactly.
Okay.
So, having said that, the rest of the outcomes of the reserves who wrote the different letters and everything is kind of a small pixel in the whole big picture. And that's part of the reason we came all the way over here, to say there is a process that brings us from a democracy which was never really had to be said twice a day or 3 times a day that Israel is a democracy. It's a liberal country, it's a democracy, it goes without saying, and we're changing.
But I will just say to you, I would imagine many are in my frame of mind, and it is more compelling that it is all of you who have served, who are not necessarily protesters normally, who don't necessarily get on a plane and say, we're coming over here to talk to you. There is a sense that of the service that you've done and the mindset that we assume about country first, Israel's defense first, Israel as a proud Jewish state first. So the fact that you've reached a breaking point is particularly compelling, I think, to the American Jewish audience, who may not understand exactly all the crossed T's and dotted I's of the judiciary reforms, but see how much you all are alarmed and saying this is a 5-alarm fire.
You cannot not be alarmed. I think when you have a cabinet member, it's not some guy from the street in a talkback in some kind of internet. That's a cabinet minister who's voting for war, and he's sitting with his own voice speaking about wiping out Palestinian village after a terrible terror attack that happened in that village, but also after a very terrible night in which settlers were attacking the civilians in this Palestinian village. So when that minister is sitting and saying, look, it's not good that these youngsters have done that at night, but I think the government should give the command to wipe out the Palestinian village. And of course he apologized, he tried to deny it, tried to interpret it.
Got a lot of criticism.
Yeah, but again, this must bring some hesitation to any honest officer who served in this army in the last 30 years and officers who are still serving. It's very clear that this kind of command, I hope it will never come, is illegal. That's very clear. You have to refuse to such a command if it
and
ever
I
comes
just want
about.
To make sure
I don't think it will come about.
You don't?
But I think just the fact that the minister is speaking in that way is horrible to all of us, because we know how it worked, we know how we built it to work, and we were very, very careful the way we conducted war up till now, and that's worrying to us all.
Let's talk about Huwara for a minute, just so everyone remembers and understands when this is broadcast. 2 Jewish settlers, brothers, one 21 years old, Hillel Yaniv, the other 19, Yagel Yaniv, were shot dead as they drove through Huwara in the West Bank on February 26, 2023. They lived in a nearby Israeli settlement, and in retribution, Israeli settlers went on a violent late-night rampage and burned through the villages. Obviously, there were hundreds injured, 1 civilian dead, the town ablaze, tremendous destruction. Some did call it a pogrom. I don't know if you're all comfortable with that word or not. But why was that a touchstone for this? Because some people see the Palestinian question as separate from these protests on the judiciary. How are they? Tell us how those are intersecting.
So I don't mind speaking about it. I think, first of all, we need to understand that given these very extreme right-wing ministers, that the settlers, some of them, the most extreme, know that they have a better backing now, maybe just wink of the eye, but not explicitly. But they know Ben Gvir, they know these people. These are the people who were protecting them in the court. And I think they feel freer to do that compared to what happened before. But after all that, I must say I'm I'm very concerned about what happened. I was much more astonished to hear the minister saying the government should give this command. So up till now, we always said, okay, these are young boys from the settlements. Maybe the parents don't control them. They come at night. We don't know the few of them. Okay, we need to control them, and the army is doing its best to stop it, sometimes more successfully, sometimes less. And I think we're all confident that the IDF is trying to do the best they can to stop this kind of horrible events. But when you do hear a minister, and by the way, it was not only that minister, like many members of his party were trying to diminish this event, say it didn't really happen, it wasn't far
that bad.
less. Yeah, so that's extremely worrying. And we have to remember, so all the things come together in that way. The same minister is trying to take some responsibilities from the defense ministry. He's the treasury minister, but he got an agreement in the coalition agreements to get some responsibilities on the life of the settlers from the defense ministry. So as you know, from 1967, the West Bank is being run by the IDF. So the Central Command is responsible for everything that happens there, both the Palestinians and the settlers. So now they want to take part of it, and they want this minister to be responsible for dealing with the settlers. That's a change, that's a legal change that may cause a change in the chain of command. He wants to appoint officers. So a political party from the very far right will appoint ministers. Up till now, I'm happy to say that our chief of staff and the defense minister is opposing that, they're not giving it. But it's in the agreements of the coalition. It's not something that we're, fantasizing about or inventing ourselves. It's all written and signed by the Likud and by the party of Smotrich. So.
And Ophir, you have really emphasized, you all have, but it's coming through very dramatically, how core to your orientation as officers, as IDF soldiers, was this moral compass. That there were guardrails and boundaries and clear rules of engagement. And you can imagine there are some in the United States, I would say particularly young people on the left, who don't imagine that the IDF works according to such stringent moral guideposts. Can you just address the audience that looks at a Huwara and says, really? Isn't this happening all the time?
Of course. I think, Israel, especially Israeli Air Force, but all Israeli IDF branches are dealing with the most challenging war or defense arena globally. It's a very condensely populated area. The terrorists are intentionally hiding their weapons, rockets, and themselves.
The terrorists are.
Yeah, within the highly populated area and within the sensitive targets, whether it's a UN camp or a hospital or other that you can pick. And I think is IDF and the Air Force has been really, really careful in choosing those targets. You can see, and we are reviewing all the targets post-action to understand what was being done, or were we successful, was anyone civilian was hit, yes or no, and why did it happen? And you can see the, we call it the surgical actions on the specific floor or surgical, yeah.
Okay.
The specific floor or window being hit, and we know on many occasions where we chose to pick smaller weapons in order to minimize the impact, risking the fact that the target will not be eliminated. So we're completely and truly trustful in that system. I think for the questions that you're asking, horrible as it may be, the actions in Hawara or any other piece that we're talking about right now, it can be an event that you debrief and learn from and say how much it was bad to happen and ask why. But when we have the whole picture, the whole direction that the government leads us, we understand that we're marching into a new reality in Israel. And we are worried about this reality. Mm-hmm. Israel, I think, is considered as a miracle. Think about the fact that the army, the whole army, is being structured and built on reservists. Without the reservists, it's very difficult to operate the military. Many volunteers are operating specific positions because we are very dedicated to the national security of Israel. And
reservists are constantly being retrained. It's not like you're sitting home for months and months.
Every week.
Every week, particularly in the Air Force.
Yeah, one day a week we come. We do it with a lot of passion. If the phone calls, we're there, no matter what we do, where we are, because we know that if we're needed, we're there. And I think it needs to be obvious that people are not saying we're not coming over anymore, we're not volunteering anymore, but they're saying we have to signal very clearly about how much we are worried from the post-legislation reality. Okay. We think it's our obligation, our moral obligation, doing so beforehand and not afterwards.
Right.
I want to say that, on my point of view, Hawara is the only symptom, because the environment has changed. I want to remind you that Ben-Gvir was elected or came into office saying that, or his agenda was, I'm going to change the rules of engagement. Now, for the young soldiers, the meaning of changing rules of engagement is being more freely using their weapons, either not by planes, but and ground forces. It has other meanings. So the environment has changed, and it's very dangerous, either for our moral values for our soldiers and for the way we act in the West Bank, but not only over there. And another thing, if you look again at the coalition, we have 4 small parties, extremists, that are pulling their strings in order to change. And this change, and they have they want this change because each one has his own incentive to do that.
Can you name the 4?
Well, we talked about Ben-Gvir, so of course he's pro-settlement, and he has his own agenda. Anti-Arab, racism,
anti-LGBTQ.
Yes, Smotrich, he never tried to deny it. He said it out publicly.
Right.
So he talked about the parade 2 years ago.
The Pride Parade.
Yeah, the Pride Parade. So they're saying it out loud.
And are you putting Bibi in the 4?
And Bibi is the one who is actually not strong enough in order to change it or to influence them. So they're taking advantage of...
Because he said in interviews that he did in the United States with Barry Weiss and with Jewish Insider that people are overstating the effect that Ben-Gvir and Smotrich will have on policies and decisions, that essentially I'm in control. That was the message. I got my hands on the tiller and they're basically reporting to me. I'm running the show. So how's that going?
And so far, the only word they can use is chaos.
And by the way, remember, Bibi said about 2 years ago that Ben-Gvir will never be a minister in his government.
And
he is. So
he's a minister.
We see things changing. So I'm not sure we should trust each and every statement.
Boy, did I cut you off on your second point. I want to just give you a chance to respond to some of the critics. They are not particularly your personal critics, but just so the audience can hear some of the slings and arrows. Communications Minister of the government, Shlomo Karhi, am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah.
Or Karhi?
Karhi, yeah.
Karhi he tweeted this to protesting reservists, quote, "To those refusing to serve, we say to them what Mordechai told Esther, profit and salvation will arise for the Jews from another place, and your father's house will be destroyed." And then his words, "The people of Israel will manage without you, and you can go to hell." And I'm just smiling because it's quite
polite.
Quite polite. And sent to all the pilots, "We're firing you, don't come." I am looking at, from Bibi, refusal to serve threatens the foundation of our existence and therefore it must have no place in our ranks. So anyone who wants to respond to that, I'm not actually even saying the worst of it, but some of you started by mentioning it. Someone, I think, called the protesters weaklings. And Likud's public diplomacy minister said conditional pilots are not patriots, not Zionists, not the best of our boys, not the people of Israel. You are weaklings falling by the wayside, and I despise each and every one of them.
Yeah, thank you.
This is ugly.
So I think
and it's coming from. This is not necessarily just people in the Twitter sphere.
These are ministers.
Ministers.
And I think that's the reason why we came here. Like when you try to communicate and speak about a constitutional change, which we think should come about with a very wide consensus, and this is the kind of words that you hear back, then you're saying, okay, we need to have other leverages to get them to the table and to understand that this is something that is going to be irreversible and we will not be part of it. And I think there are no other pilots. The tragic thing is that many of these ministers never served in the army or served for 3 months. I think it's quite difficult to replace hundreds of fighter pilots. It takes time. It's crucial. Israel cannot function without its Air Force. And half of the Air Force, I don't know how many, are reservists. So I think better words should be used. There's more honor to have to the people who serve the country for very long. We come here to the airport and you hear United Airlines saying if there are any service people, they go first on the airplane. They don't tell them to go to hell. Yeah. And they don't call them traitors. So I think we're speaking up our minds. It's clear that this government was chosen in election, but again, in America, you know very well the tyranny of the majority. So it's not only being a majority, you cannot change the whole game and the non-existing constitution, but we know what democracy is. And some of these parties that we mentioned earlier are saying explicitly we don't want women to be in the service. So things that took us years and years to bring about, with the Supreme Court help, will be cancelled immediately. And you could do nothing. There would be no assistance. You cannot go to the Supreme Court. The government of 61 can decide whatever they want. This is the tyranny of the majority.
So just so I understand, the three of you are part of hundreds, but you have no name. Am I right? There is no group, there's no organization, there's no website. If people want to support what's going on or even follow it, understand it, like how do they find you all? Is there any way to connect?
We do have a website that will be down here.
Yes, yeah, give it to us and we'll make sure to put it.
But we must say it's all improvised very quickly. We don't have anyone to finance us. We didn't choose a name because we were busy arranging the meetings here in DC. And I don't even know if we'll exist if there will be a compromise and if we come back to Israel and hopefully, you know, the coalition and the opposition sits together and get to an agreement together with the president or whomever. So we don't have a name. Suggestions will be welcome.
Yeah, the JBS audience will send some in. But how did you find that each of you connect? Did you all know each other? Did you serve together?
Job and I served together. I knew his brother. He wrote an email to me, connected me to Job, and that's the end of the story.
And his brother used to work for me in the army. So
it's simple as that.
It's all family.
We are all family.
But when you look at the hundreds, I'm sure there's many different tentacles and connections.
They're all linked to us through the past service and.
And is there any kind of I won't say infighting, but disagreement as to how public to be and how to manage this? I mean, did anyone say don't come to America, don't speak on television?
First of all, the ones that are signed the letter, it's non-political, so we're not left or right, and we just reserve officers that want to speak out, and so that's for us.
Yeah, there were people. It is a debate in Israel. We were also speaking and being interviewed by the Israeli radio channels, and hopefully soon in the Israeli TV. And there are people who are opposing us coming here, and there were people who didn't sign our letter, both because they wanted something more to the right or to the left. So it's not that everybody agrees with us, and as you said, it's unprecedented. So when you do something for the first time, clearly there are people who disagree, who have different thoughts. But
it's also Jews.
Yeah.
2 Jews, 3 opinions.
Well, you don't know how long it took to phrase this letter with 150 people with 200 different views.
Yes.
But we decided to come here, and thank God we still have democracy and freedom, and we can decide to take an airplane and come and speak and ask people for meetings. And whomever accepts us, not everybody also accepts us on this side of the ocean, we're happy to speak and we're happy to share our concerns. And clearly there are other people in Israel who have different views. That's okay.
Yeah. Ophir, you said you were at there was a rally in D.C. yesterday. We're speaking on March 13th. Is it March 13th?
I was in New York, in Washington.
Oh,
no, but there was also one in D.C.
Yeah.
Okay, and I just wanted to quote you because I watched a video of it. You said a very powerful line, "We will not sit idle while they try to change our country's soul." I want you to, I'm sure you didn't pick those words arbitrarily. Some might say that's hyperbole, that's exaggeration. You obviously believe in those words.
Sure, and I think a lot of people do. I think it's not common that 500,000 people march from their homes at Saturday night instead of being with their families, instead of resting for the weekend before the week starts. It's not easy. Traveling, busy demonstrations, maybe sometimes unpleasant because of police and other things that happen over there. And I think it's truly reflecting what we feel. We feel that's not the same Israel tomorrow after the legislation passes. our country's soul, and I think it's the Jewish soul of inclusiveness, of kindness, non-racism, since we always suffer from racism. That's how we expect, that's the Declaration of Independence of Israel. That's our informal constitution. And what we see right now is trying to change that. Not only trying to change that, but also rewrite history, and all the figures, the heroes of our history are being blackened, like Aaron Barak, which was the Supreme Court chief, head of Supreme Court. He's now being treated as traitor because it's not fitting to the agenda of the current government. And the kind words or not kind words that were used by the ministers, I think it doesn't reflect on us. It reflects on the people who said them, and only demonstrates, their thoughts, unlike our intentions. And you asked, Yoav, why did we come here? We came here because we want to support Israel. It's not people are treating us as we're trying to hurt Israel, like the BDS. We're totally opposite to BDS. We are trying to support Israel and to communicate with the government, since it's very, very difficult, through other channels that always supports Israel, by donations, by voting, by other means. I think the relationship between the U.S. and Israel has always been warm. It's strategic for Israel, and that's why we're here. We're saying the way to support us is to communicate with the government and
say that it matters.
And transfer the feeling that we're riding 200 miles per hour to a wall.
So I've heard, I'm sure, many times that American Jews are told, you're not putting your lives on the line, so keep your opinions to yourself. We're glad you send planes and trips and kids and money and, come over as tourists, and, your kids come to study there, but you're not volunteering and you're not serving, and so your opinions are kind of not important to us. And now you're telling us that we actually do have a voice that matters. Can anybody, without telling you about sort of my Jewish therapy of not necessarily knowing if our voices are welcome, do you think this is an inflection point for American Jews to step up in some way?
I think that's the main reason we came here. We came here not to tell the American Jews what to do or what to say, but we came here to say that we do have a problem. We expect the American Jews to take a stand and act. What they will do, it's up to them. They're capable enough to think of the solutions or who to talk to and how to do it. And another thing that is really important to say is that the society in Israel is tearing apart. And the threats we see inside is probably larger than the one from the outside these days. And that's something that, as Jews, I think that the American Jews have to also care about.
Go ahead, John.
For us in the intelligence, it's our profession to alert people to risks before they happen and not after the fact. Our biggest trauma is the 1973 war. And we think like telling people after the fact, it would be too late. And they will complain, why did you come earlier? And now we're coming earlier to say things may change radically, very, very quickly. And to my mind, America, both the Jewish communities, but also the administration, is part of our national security. And it's not as if we are the only ones speaking in English. I think there are other people from other views in Israel that are getting money and influence from influential people in the US. And I think it's proper that our views will also be heard. I've been here in many capacities as an officer, talking to my colleagues in the high-tech company, raising money in America, being active, and also in terms of Jewish pluralism, I was active in the US and very impressed with what I've seen. And I think American Jewry is our brothers, not less than the people in Israel. Some in Israel, like I can say Ben Gvir for me is not a brother. So I think it's completely natural for me to come over here and speak. I didn't do that before because I didn't see the same sense of urgency. But at the moment, since we're not being listened to, and the legislation goes through, we need others to speak up.
So there is a compromise that's being discussed. I mean, it's being debated, and it looks like so far no traction. But the president, Herzog, has spoken out publicly, and he ratcheted up his rhetoric last weekend, saying basically this is untenable. So are you all hopeful, optimistic that actually a compromise will be coming?
I can speak for myself. I'm not optimistic, but I can say that if I would see that the coalition and opposition sit together with the president and get to agreements, since I'm not a legal expert, I'm not a politician myself, if there will be a wide consensus about the change, me personally, I will accept it. But as long as we get these words coming at us from formal government officials telling us to go to hell, I prefer America on hell, so I went to America to speak. And I'll go elsewhere, I'll do anything that I can do in my capacity. I also have a son who's on reserve as a combat soldier, and I'm worried about what's about to happen. So I'll keep speaking up as long as I can and wherever I can.
And would you address, Joab, those who say that the judiciary, these changes are too draconian, but they do have too much power, that the balance of power is out of whack? Can you just address that as succinctly as you can?
Again, I'm not a legal expert, but as a novice, as someone who doesn't understand about legal issues, I look at the experts, and I can see that there's an overwhelming majority of experts. Some of them were appointed by Bibi, like Mendelblit, who was the Attorney General, and many others, like Professor Dershowitz here, who were staunch supporters of Bibi.
Yeah.
And they're all saying this kind of reform is a disaster. So I believe them. Even if Smotrich has one person on his side, I think it's extremely clear what the experts are saying. By the way, not only the legal experts, but also the economists and national security experts. People are speaking up.
Yes, I just want to, you mentioned Avichai Mandelblit. He was Bibi's former Attorney General and confidant. Bibi chose him. And just this last weekend, he said that if the proposed changes pass into law, Israel will cease being a democracy. He also said that Israel's in a historic period that will be remembered for generations, and that you have something here that harms the basic foundations of the government system, those in whose spirit the state of Israel was founded. So I just want to echo. Just as we get towards the end, I just want to touch on a letter that you may have seen from. There were soldiers in Entebbe. Have you seen this? That went viral. Do you want to describe just who they are? And I can read it, but just a bit of background on.
I don't have enough information. So
Okay.
if you have them.
No, to be honest, I know at least one of them, but these are people that were fighting to rescue, back in 1976, I think it was, kidnapped Israeli citizens who were taking over to Entebbe, and they wrote against Bibi. To be honest, for my own taste, I don't like mentioning to Bibi his dead brother. I think it's unfair and shouldn't be done. It's too painful. Why? I think there's a lot of criticism that should come Bibi's way, but we can speak for an whole hour, and we don't need to mention the dead brother. It's not in place.
And just so viewers understand, his brother Yoni died in Entebbe.
He was killed.
He was the only one killed.
Yeah, and he was commanding the operation.
I just want to give you all a chance for a last statement. Maybe why you came, if you can kind of just reiterate why now, why this matters so much to you, and what you would love our audience to take away. If there was not just a feeling but a charge, a sense of maybe something that you think we could do. Again, there's always that both respectfulness and a sense that we are not there, that we are not also on the line in the same way that you and your children are. Let's start with you, Roy.
Well, I'm a patriotic Israeli reserve officer, and I don't have to prove that I'm patriotic. I served for 30 years, and I love my country. And I'm worried. First time in my life, I'm worried about what's happening in my country. For my sake, for the people, my kids, where are they going to grow up? And I think that there is a way to get out of it, and the reason I came here again is to spread the word and find audience that will want to hear us and maybe decide to take a stand or do something about it.
And Roy, has there ever been a moment where you were criticized or you heard the criticism, maybe not directly at you personally, and it gave you pause, that it shook you?
The only time that it shook me is when the ministers called us terrorists. We risked our lives. My kids are serving in the army, both of them, and they're risking their lives, and call us terrorists or anarchists and words like that. This is the criticism I cannot take.
Yeah, for me, it's, as I said, it's about the urgency of the matter. Things may become irreversible in very few weeks. And I think the US administration and American Jews still have a huge influence on Israel. And they know how to do it. You can speak to your representatives in the Congress. You can call your friends in Israel. You can speak up in the media. You can sign letters. I think the pressure could work. Our Prime Minister is very mindful of America's support to Israel. He knows how important it is. He wouldn't want to lose it. And the only thing you need to tell him is stop what you're doing right now. There is no reason it would take 2 months. You just was elected. You were elected for 4 years. You can wait for half a year. Go sit down with the president, as the president asked, stop the legislation. Go and sit with the opposition. I think the opposition said if the legislation would be stopped, we will sit together and we will get to consensus. So that's how you do constitutional change. And I think the US has a great tradition of democracy, constitution, how you do amendments to constitution, and very basic principles of what majorities can do or cannot do in democracy.
When you think about this country that you obviously love, and that is a miracle, and you look at what's happening now, do you think that it was a fragile project? That it could be susceptible to a moment like this?
My own interpretation is there are factions in Israel, some of them represented by parties, some of them are outside of
factions.
The political system, who have very different views and ideologies about how the state of Israel should look like. And we think it's really important to keep Israel as it is and as it always was, based on the Declaration of Independence and based on the moral principle and the Jewish principles that we all appreciate.
Thank you. Ophir.
Yesterday we spoke at the BJ community in New York.
B'nai Jeshurun.
Yes.
Synagogue.
Yes. And I said there that when I look at Israel and when I close my eyes, I'm thinking where I'm dreaming to be, where my kids will dream to be at, and it's Israel. It's our state. We also, as Jews, always pray L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, next year to be in Jerusalem, and I think that's why we're here. We want to make sure that it's going to stay that way and not change after the legislation and the changing of the country's soul and being more like Iran than a Jewish state.
Tell us how people can find you. What's the website? Do you know it by heart?
I think it's ilfordemocracy.org.
Okay, slowly.
But IL for number 4, democracy.org.
Great.
But we'll check it out soon.
And we'll put it on the screen. So I want to thank Colonel Ophir Ber. I want to thank Colonel Joab Rosenberg and Brigadier General Roy Rifton. Thank you for getting on the plane, for coming and talking to us, for making this time today. And to our audience, thank you for being here on In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin, and I'll see you next time.